welcome back to all of you. My name is Dr. Roderick Carey. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Center for Urban Education. It is such an honor to work with this dynamic scholar that I'm about to introduce. So what we have here is a mixture of all the K through second grade folks who worked with us yesterday, and then also those of you who are 3 to 5. We're here together to hear a keynote from Dr. Terry Husband, and I would like to introduce him more formally to you. Dr. Terry Husband is the Associate Professor of Early Childhood and Elementary Literacy at Illinois State University. Dr. Husband earned his master's and PhD in early childhood and multicultural education from the Ohio State University, or as they say, the Ohio State University. I don't know what that is all about. He currently teaches undergraduate and graduate levels courses in literacy education, diversity in P-12 contexts, multicultural education, and theories of teaching and learning. His research interests involve critical literacy in early childhood classrooms, racial representations in children's literature, and literacy development among diverse student populations. He also teaches children in P through 5 classrooms about race and racism in ways that are critical and developmentally appropriate, and that's something that I think he's going to speak about today. He has published 3 books related to these topics. How am I supposed to talk about that? Enacting anti-racist pedagogy in early childhood classrooms, Read and Succeed Practices to Support Reading Skills in African American Boys, which is the book that we provided for participants here. But I don't see color, The Perils, Practices, and Possibilities of Anti-Racist Education, which is right here. This is this book, which you don't have. You can find this online. Go buy this. This is a good read. Get your money together and get this book. And then he has a 4th book, as a plug, Effective Literacy Strategies for Students in Early Childhood and Elementary Classroom, which will be published later this summer. That is a remarkably productive scholar, awesome teacher, educator, brilliant facilitator. We have evidence of that from yesterday. Please welcome Dr. Terry Husband.
Welcome back again. I see some friendly faces in the audience. Thank you, Roger, for such a humbling introduction. It always amazes me when people say all these wonderful things. It scares you because you're like, I hope I can live up to what they're saying about me. So welcome back again. The title of my keynote this morning is Reading in the Dark, Using Multicultural Literature to Develop Critical Racial Awareness and Consciousness in Children in P through 5 classrooms. So before I get started, I would just like to take a moment to kind of acknowledge and thank a few folks. I've had a tremendously wonderful experience over the last day and a half or so. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Erica Kestenberg. Let's give her a hand. Facilitate everything. I also would like to acknowledge the other Associate Director, Dr. Lori. I'd like to acknowledge Amy, who helped with all my travel arrangements and lodging. Get to where you're supposed to be, so I'm grateful for that. And then I would also like to acknowledge Dr. Richard Milner, the Director of the Center for Urban Education. Really a phenomenal leading scholar in the field of urban education. In this line of work, we meet different kinds of people. Some people we consider them to be colleagues, some people we consider them to be friends, and then some people we consider them to be family members. And it's rare that you will find one person who falls into each category simultaneously, and so Richard is one of those people, and so I'm definitely grateful for the invitation to be able to come and share on his turf. So it's really wonderful. And then last but not least, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for coming up here today. Interested in the dialogue at the end, and so hopefully we'll have a question and answer session at the end of this. The year was 1962. John F. Kennedy was the President of the United States of America. Wilt Chamberlain scored a record 73 points against the Chicago Bulls. Jackie Robinson became the first African American to be elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame. John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth. and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested during a demonstration in Georgia. In addition to these historical facts, the year 1962 was a remarkable year for another important reason. That is, a children's book entitled The Snowy Day was first published. While this book may appear to be no different than any other children's book on the market today, it was controversial for a number of reasons. One in particular, this was the first time a black character was the main character in a children's book. Now, one might easily assume that this book was controversial because it portrayed black masculinity in a hyper-aggressive, hypersexual, hyper-violent manner, much like today. I mean, there was no Snoop Dogg in the book. There was no Stevie J, shout out to my lovely hip-hop fans. There was no Lil Wayne, etc. Instead, the book simply depicted a black boy named Peter who had a wonderful day playing outside in the snow. The real reason this book was so controversial was because it was the first time that blackness was made front and center in a children's book while whiteness was pushed to the background. Although 50 years have passed since the publication of this first book, race is still very much a controversial issue in society in general, as well as in elementary and early childhood classrooms in particular. So therefore, I would like to take the rest of this morning to talk about how we can use multicultural children's literature to help build children's awareness of the complexities and controversies associated with race in meaningful and constructive ways. So what's the problem? The problem is essentially threefold. Number one, when we think about the society all around us, schools have and continue to become increasingly racially, culturally, linguistically diverse. Demographers predict that by the year 2030, 2035, the majority of students in U.S. classrooms will be from racially diverse classrooms. In addition to that, racism is very much alive and well in the world around us. When we look at our timeline, on our social media pages, when we look at the media, CNN, Fox News, well maybe not Fox News, but we look at CNN, we find that racism is very much a part of the fabric of the United States culture today. However, in spite of these two demographic imperatives, most teachers still opt to teach what we call colorblind perspectives for a number of reasons. Typically, you'll have teachers that fall into one of three different categories. Either number one, teachers will say students don't have the cognitive ability to be able to understand race and racism in many other ways as adults. So they'll say they're too young to learn about that, particularly early childhood teachers. I'm an early childhood teacher at heart, so I always kind of revert back to that. Secondly, there are some teachers who will sort of use the politically neutral argument as a reason why they don't talk about race and racism. They'll say things like, I only want to teach the curriculum. I only want to be neutral. I don't want to ruffle any feathers whatsoever. And whether they realize it or not, there is no such thing as a politically neutral teaching act. Whenever we're teaching for something, and we're teaching against something. And then finally, you'll have some teachers, these are my favorites, they like to use the academic argument as a reason or rationale why they want to avoid race in the curriculum. What do I mean by the academic argument? In other words, the whole idea, I got to get through the Common Core standards. Anybody know any teachers like that? They'll say, if it's not in the standards, I don't need to teach it. And my response is like, what about going to the bathroom? The bathroom's not in the standards, and you go to the bathroom every single day. But when we combine these things together, one of the things that we find is that more and more teachers tend to opt for a colorblind perspective than engaging in issues of race and racism in critical ways. So what's so bad about this particular approach, right? I wish I could tell you that not teaching children about race and racism, not dealing with these issues in the curriculum is a safe, neutral way of teaching that has no consequences. But the reality of it is, more and more studies are coming out that's showing the exact opposite. Number one, it doesn't equip students with the skills, knowledge, and dispositions necessary to identify racism and respond to it in constructive ways. And so what happens is, we begin to create little people who become big people who don't have the dialogue, the language to be able to deal with racist acts in society in meaningful ways. And so as adults, they become very, very apathetic. Then number two is this. When we think about the curriculum, when we don't inject racially diverse perspectives, the curriculum by default centers on whiteness. And so many students, both white and black, become robbed of opportunities to learn about the rich cultures and histories of people of color in society. And then we think about the third reason. When we don't begin dealing with race in critical ways in the classroom, we sort of shy away from those conversations. We begin giving our students a false consciousness of race that, again, doesn't give them a true understanding of the world around them. Using a Paulo Freire term, they get sort of a magical consciousness of race. You say, what's a magical consciousness of race? The whole idea that every racial group in society gets along perfectly well. There is no such thing as racism. And so when they see a person gets pulled over and gets shot by, an unarmed person gets shot by a police officer, they don't have the language or dialogue to begin to deconstruct some of those issues. And so I argue that multicultural literature can be a very, very vital tool in terms of us helping to engage children in these conversations. So why should we teach children about race? I'm glad you asked. I'll be happy to tell you. At least 6 different reasons. I'll spend a little time, the remaining time, talking about those 6 different reasons. Number 1 is implicit racial bias. Although we know, and it's been documented in the research, that teachers have implicit racial bias, believe it or not, young children as early as age 3, 4, 5, they begin having bias against certain folks who don't necessarily look like them or act like them. And so, unless we engage that through critical multicultural literature, it's difficult for students to begin to disrupt some of those things. Then we think about racial identity development in terms of children developing a positive racial identity for themselves and others in society. It's vitally, vitally important for them to see other people who look like them and not like them in positive roles. We think about the racist messages that children are bombarded with in society, racial literacy in terms of understanding society, racism among children, among other children who are not like them, and the curriculum itself. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time just kind of unpacking that. Okay, now, so what do I mean by implicit racial bias? When we think about implicit racial bias, psychologists point to this idea that children tend to have what we call in-group bias towards people who look like them and out-group prejudice towards people who are not like them. What do I mean by that? Boys like boys, right? You see little boys at the play center. All of a sudden, the boys with the cars at the sand table, a little girl comes over there and they'll say, "Get out of here. This is for boys only." Anybody ever seen that? Well, the same thing applies as it relates to race. You'll have many, many young white children who say, "I only like other children who are white, who look just like me." But the unfortunate piece is because we live in a society where white supremacy is so prevalent that you have black children, Asian children, Latino American children who, instead of saying, "I only want to be around people who look like me," they tend to prefer whiteness over their own racial identity. And so it's critically, critically important for us to disrupt that as teachers through the use of multicultural children's literature. It's this whole idea of what we call low status, perceived low status versus high status. Anybody here drive a Lexus vehicle, right? Anybody here got a Lexus, right? There are certain things that are, and they're like, "No, we're teachers, we don't." It's the wrong crowd, it's down the street, right? When you think about, for example, there are certain things, even as adults, certain material things that we have a perceived high value. I have a close friend of mine, he drives a Lexus, and he's so into the whole idea that Lexus is a luxury car. And I put him aside one day and I said, "Bro, you know, a Lexus is really made by Toyota Camry." And he's like, "No, but the whole idea is that we attach certain values to certain things in life. It's perfectly okay if it deals with your automobile, your choice of clothing, but when it comes to other human beings, it's unacceptable." And so it's important for us to use multicultural children's literature to begin to disrupt this whole idea in young children. And so what we're going to do is look at a small video clip that kind of talks about this whole idea of implicit racial bias among children from another perspective.
I had a quick question.
I'm sorry.
Our second major finding, even black children as a...
Yes.
So, some of the literature that we've read, I'll tell people about who I am later on at lunch, has shown that there's this kind of distinctive, identifiable age period where some of those changes occur. And so some of the research says that kids 2 and 2.5, they prefer their own group. Something happens between 2.5 and 3, 3.5, so they start to prefer white. And I just wonder if you've read anything that helps to kind of understand, like explain how that happens or why that happens.
Yeah, we can talk about it a little bit more at the end, if that's okay? So I can
Yeah,
give you the
sure.
context during the, thank you so much for that question,
Okay.
question and answer session.
All have some bias toward whiteness, far less than white children.
The smart child.
Yeah, right here,
The
that.
smart child. Okay, show me the dumb child. And why is she the dumb child? No, show me the ugly child. And why is she the ugly child? Show me the good-looking child. And why is she the good-looking child? And show me the skin color you believe most people think looks bad on a girl.
A student will either way, like when you're
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what you look like, but it's always
Show me the good-looking child. Yeah. Show me the child you like as a classmate. You like all of them as classmates? Why do you say all of them?
I don't really care what color they have.
This 5-year-old girl gave some provocative answers during her test. I asked her about them later.
Because it looks like this kind because this looks a lot like that. I just don't like the way brown looks because the way brown looks really nasty for some reason, but I don't know what reason.
So you think it looks nasty?
Well, not really, but sometimes.
Sometimes. And Brielle, they ask you what color adults don't like. What do you say? That's right, that's what you say. Why do you think adults don't like that?
Dark.
Dark. And adults, you think adults don't like dark?
Well, maybe some adults do, but maybe some of them don't.
The questions that got overwhelmingly white-biased answers?
Show me the one you think most children would think looks bad on a boy.
More than 70% of the older black children chose the darkest skin tones.
Show me the child who has a skin color most children don't like.
More than 61% of the younger black children chose the 2 darkest shades.
Show me the ugly child.
More than 57% of the younger black kids chose the 2 darkest shades. Dr. Spencer says the research shows the bias toward white is still very much part of our culture.
All kids are exposed to these stereotypes, but what's really significant here is that white children are learning or maintaining those stereotypes much more strongly than the African American children.
And that is our third finding, the finding that interested Dr. Spencer the most, that overall younger and older children keep the same patterns, stereotypes. In other words, their ideas change little from age 5 to 10.
Ordinarily, by the time children are older, there's this sort of a natural filter, their own ways of thinking sort of aids them in sort of rethinking the extreme stereotypic sort of responses to become less highly biased.
That left Professor Spencer wondering what's causing this pattern. She speculates that kids are bombarded by stereotypical messages, and that adults in kids' lives have to fight to override the deluge. Black parents may be more diligent about that, while white parents may not notice the need.
The messages are the same for all children, and therefore the test is the same for all parents. Parents have to reframe what children experience.
We realize these findings may be disturbing and that some people will question this project's conclusions. What stereotypic messages are being sent in a country that elected a black man president?
I, Barack Hussein Obama.
Like all research projects, ours is not perfect. Some kids were told ahead of time they'd be asked about race. Some children identified as one race but came from biracial families, like this boy whose mom is white. But Professor Spencer tells us these are common issues in research, and the results can still be trusted because of the sample size. To be clear, this is a scientifically informed and executed pilot study, which suggests the need for further research. The results point to major trends, but are not the definitive word on children and race. Still, they underline what Dr. Spencer sees as an alarming conclusion.
We are still living in a society where dark things are devalued and light things are valued.
The question we're left with is, where do we go from here? Anderson Cooper, CNN.
So again, we see there from the video, did everybody catch what the young lady said about black skin looks nasty? And so we see, because white supremacy begins at a very, very early age along a lot of different lines, that children are internalizing these messages. And the less we're, as teachers, we are courageous about disrupting some of this information, that they continue to carry this on for a remainder of their lives. And so it's vitally, vitally important for us to do so. Then we think about positive racial identity development. Number 2. In order for children to develop a positive racial identity, a healthy, non-superior racial identity, meaning that I don't think that my race is better than any other race in society, psychological researchers point out they have to have multiple and ongoing engagement with people who don't look like them. Well, while we may not necessarily be able to construct a social world that does that, through children's literature, vicariously they can see positive people who don't look like them, who occupy different races. I always like to use this example when I'm working with my pre-service teachers in my teacher education courses. If I'm white and I live in an all-white affluent neighborhood, and everybody around me in my social world is white, my church is white, and the only Latino person I see is the person who comes over and cuts my grass, well, guess what? I'm going to be more susceptible to accepting stereotypes that Latinos can only be landscapers. But through literature, if I learn about Cesar Chavez, I learn about Latino people in powerful positions, Latinos and CEOs. So now my worldview about people who don't look like me becomes challenged. So it's vitally, vitally important for us to do so. I like to use the metaphor that Dr. Ruding Bishop, Professor Emeritus from The Ohio State University, uses, that multicultural, back to the beginning, right? She likes to refer to multicultural education, multicultural literature as providing mirrors, windows, and sliding doors. Mirrors meaning that I can see myself reflected and affirmed in the literature. So if I'm African American, I'm Latino American, Native American, I can see other folks who look like me, who can affirm my being in this world. We think about windows. So let's say, for example, I'm a white child. I can learn or look into the world experiences of other people who are not like me in a positive manner. And then we think about, more recently, this whole idea of sliding doors. How many people remember when you were a child and you wanted to go outside and play? Anybody remember that? You want to go, before they had video games, right? Play now was always digital. But all of a sudden you say, Mama, can I go outside? And the mama would say, yeah, you can go through the patio door, open the door, you can go outside, but make sure you close the door. Then you go outside and play with your friends. Then all of a sudden you come back in and your mama would say, you better close that door. You're going to stay out or stay in. Anybody had a mama like that? You're not going to be letting this air condition get out of here. But the whole idea that and from a social-emotional perspective, a fun perspective, that the patio door represented fun and exciting period where you could go visit for a period of time and then come back to the realities of the world. Multicultural children's literature provides that opportunity for us to move beyond simply facts and figures. Sometimes when we think about diverse literature, we only think about facts and figures. We don't even think about children learning about the fun experience that other people of color are having in society. So I believe multicultural literature provides a very, very powerful tool for us to actually do those things. Now, what about the curriculum? We think about the curriculum, both the formal, the mandated curriculum, as well as the informal curriculum. In many, many ways, it marginalizes, minimalizes, and it oftentimes even excludes totally the experiences of people of color. I borrow a phrase from one of my social studies colleagues I work with, that most of what's taught in school is male, pale, and stable. What do I mean by that? It's on maleness, right? We know about Abraham Lincoln. We know about Thomas Jefferson, right? It's white, and then it tends to be historical in nature. And so multicultural literature allows us to disrupt a lot of those things and begin to make it more problematic and more contextualized. So instead of just learning about the historical events of people in society, we can also learn about some of the more contemporary experiences as well. And so I argue that multicultural literature can be a very, very powerful tool. Even for our white students. Again, working with pre-service teachers who are by and large, majority are white. Every now and then I'll have a speck of color down here or there, but most of the time it's usually white women. There's nothing wrong with that. But so we'll talk about Christopher Columbus and him not being the hero or the martyr that people make them out to be. And so my students will start, we'll be crying, they'll be mortified, and they'll say, why didn't anybody tell me this? Now these are 21-year-old white women who said through their K through 12 and even early college experience, nobody ever told them about additional narratives of people of color in society. And so it's vitally, vitally important for us, I argue, for us to start really early, so we'll have to do less deprogramming later on in life. And then we think about the textbooks that are used in early childhood settings and elementary settings, pre-K through 5. Most of the texts that are used with children, whether it be your guided reading textbooks, your professional textbooks, the books that you use even for pleasure or intentional reading instruction, one of the things that Jane Ganji found is that there's an unbearable presence of whiteness in this book. So let's say, for example, I'm at the kidney table, right? How many people here like those kidney tables? I'm doing my guided reading instruction. I call Alejandro over. I say, Alejandro, you're on the level C, B, or 2, whichever leveling system you're using. And then I'm using these books. It's very, very probable that most of the books that I'm going to use, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, won't reflect his own experiences. And so when we think about this whole idea of proficient reader strategies, making connections, it becomes more and more difficult to activate prior knowledge, activate schema, when everybody in the book and their experiences have nothing to do with my lived realities. And so it's important for us to be intentional. We wonder why certain groups of students tend to perform well, other groups of students not so much as it relates to reading and literacy skills. Well, it becomes more and more difficult for them to connect with what they're reading. And so it's vitally, vitally important for us to use multicultural literature for us to begin to challenge many of these issues. Now, what about individual acts of racism? Now, we all love children. I hope we're working with children. We should love them. But we think about children. We will all love to think that children are wonderful angels. They never do anything wrong. But the reality of it is, more and more studies have shown that even young children, oftentimes in classrooms, on the playground, and even in day-to-day life, commit racist acts against other children. And so, for many of us, that's really, really hard to sort of accept. And I'll show you some data that kind of support that. But what happens is, even though they're committing these acts against each other, because so many teachers hold on to what we call a colorblind mind, they're afraid or they choose not to begin to deal with those things, because the whole idea that racism doesn't exist. So when Johnny called Tyrone the N-word, then they'll say, no, he didn't mean it like that. And he'll say, well, why did he use that word instead of not another word? And so, again, multicultural literature allows us to deal with some of these things. I gave you a perfect example, and then I'll kind of move on. So one of the things I do at Illinois State University is I supervise student teachers, supervise clinical students. And so one of the things that happened recently, my context that I'm in is a rural context, predominantly white context. So my students will go out into the surrounding school districts. And so this past spring semester, we had one African-American student teacher who went out into a largely predominantly white school district where probably 98% of the students that there were all white. And so her cooperating teacher was using the book Last Stop on Market Street. Anybody read that book before? And so there's a piece in the book where there's a black little boy who's taking a bus ride through the city and he's meeting different people, etc. Well, while the teacher was using the book, all the students were at the carpet, all white students. One little white boy raises his hand and says, black people are ugly, they have really dirty skin. The cooperating teacher did nothing to disrupt that. The black student teacher was in the back of the classroom absolutely mortified. So she goes back and tells one of my colleagues, our social study instructor, who's white, Nancy, really wonderful person. She said, what do I need to do about that? Should I say something to the cooperating teacher? I don't even know how to handle that. And Nancy's a white woman. She said, let me go ask Dr. Husband. I'll get back to you. And so it's important for us, again, as we think about race, to even have cross-racial alliances, so we can go to people and say, what should I actually do about this situation? I don't know what to do. And so, again, there are so many classrooms, that's just a snapshot, where teachers are courageous or they choose purposely not to disrupt those issues of race, and racism becomes exacerbated in a lot of different ways. Now, these are just some examples of some research to support the idea that children oftentimes commit racist acts against each other. We think about, for example, a really, really famous book by Altadale and Fee, sociologist, where they went into a preschool classroom, and a white girl informed a black girl she could not go swimming because she would make the water dirty. And so, again, they documented this. This is among preschoolers. You see in Hirschfield's work, white children didn't allow the black children to play certain activities because of race. And so they're over there playing around. The black children come over there. Again, that whole group idea of in-group, out-group exclusion. In the second grade classroom, Patricia Ramsey's work and Metnick's work, where white children were reprimanded the children of color using threats. And so now it becomes more and more violent because, again, whatever they're learning at home, whatever they're learning in society, if teachers aren't courageous and willing to disrupt that, these things continue to grow and become worse. And then Baker's work in 2010, a preschooler said white people got their skin from God, black people got their skin from the devil. And so again, these things are going on, and so when teachers put on blinders, teachers have a colorblind mind, they continue to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. Now, what about the racist messages that children are receiving from society, family members, and peers? Children are being socialized in a society where they're constantly being bombarded with these messages from friends, family members, big brothers, big sisters, TV, media, etc., that aren't getting challenged at home, by and large, and then they get to school, and if they have a teacher who's not willing to disrupt that, it continues to grow and grow and grow unfettered in so many ways. Let me give you an example. So let's suppose Johnny's in the living room, his mom's in the kitchen, cooking some food. All of a sudden he's playing with this little toy truck, he's dragging it back and forth across the floor. Then all of a sudden the news is on, Fox News. Our wonderful president, number 45, comes on and said, we need to build a wall for those illegals. Then 5 seconds later, all of a sudden here's Ben Carson, he comes up there and says, yes, because African Americans were voluntary immigrants. And then mom's still cooking dinner, doesn't say anything. He internalized that message. He goes to preschool the next day. They're over at the Tactile Center. They have Legos. They're like, yeah, let's build a tower. He's like, yeah, let's build a wall for those illegals. Now, all of a sudden, what he's hearing, because mom's not disrupting it, the teacher lives in a colorblind space. It continues to grow and grow and grow. And it's transferred to the other children in the group. So now they're on the playground saying, yeah, let's build a wall for the illegals. Now, 4-year-olds are saying this, who become 14-year-olds, who become adults. And so it's important for us to use multicultural literature for us to begin to challenge some of these notions. Now, what about racial literacy? In order for our students to understand how systems of oppression operate in society, how marginalization exists, how to identify it, it's vitally important for us to talk about race in our classrooms, to use what Paulo Freire calls moving from a magical consciousness to a critical and political consciousness. What do I mean by magical consciousness? I kind of talked a little bit about this with my group from yesterday. That whole idea of it's a small world after all, we shall overcome, everybody gets together, we're a melting pot, right? And so then when they see racism in society, now there is a period of cognitive dissonance because it's like, wait a minute, you told me everybody get together, we're all the same, we're all different. You see those nice wonderful posters, but now they don't know how to A, identify racism, and B, how to respond to it in constructive ways. And so multicultural literature provides that platform for us to begin to engage young children early on so they'll be equipped with the tools to be able to disrupt some of those systems. Now, what exactly do I mean by multicultural children's literature? When we're talking about multicultural literature, we're talking about literature that's written for, by, and about people of color and other diverse groups in society, where the experiences of people of color are at the forefront of the book, and they're told in many cases by people of color. That's really important because as teachers, I'm a teacher too, we love checklists, and so it's easy to sort of pick up a book and say, hey, I see a black person in the background, got that black view, check. I see an Asian person over there, got my Asian, check. Native American, check. One of the things that we want to do as we're thinking about multicultural literature is to critically analyze whatever we're using to sort of say, is this being told by, about, whatever particular racial group, and are their experiences authentic? Are they rich? Is this a quality theme throughout the book? What about the images, etc.? So that way we can do more justice than harm, because it's equally much as damaging to use poor quality literature that have experiences of people of color than it is to not use that literature at all. And so it's vitally important for us as teachers to spend some time critically analyzing the text that we're using in our classroom. And those are just a few examples right here. Now, when we think about how to use it in our classroom, there are essentially 4 different ways that we can use multicultural literature. Again, depending on our students, depending on our context, they're going to vary. Sometimes we may use more than one approach. Sometimes we may just use one particular approach at one particular moment in time. But essentially, number 1 is what we call the reader's response approach. Building on Louise Rosenblatt's work, the whole idea of reader's response theory, where we encourage students to bring their social, cultural, and racially constructed experiences to what they're reading. They have an interaction with the text and what's said in the text, and then they construct the new meaning. And so if a little boy is in a 2nd grade classroom and he talks about, yeah, my dad said he was pulled over by the cops, we don't shy away from that. We invite that into the classroom, and then as we're reading the book, we construct additional meanings. And so we don't sort of say, hey, we don't want to talk about that at school. Instead, we begin to encourage students to share their own experiences. Then there's what we call the inquiry-based or problem-based approach, where something may come up in society, in our classroom, on the playground, etc., around issues of race and racism or racial marginalization, and then we use that as a platform to begin engaging race. So let's say, for example, most of us here are early childhood, elementary teachers. You'll have shared time or circle time in your classroom, and then all of a sudden you say, does somebody have something special to say? All of a sudden Alejandro will say, yeah, my dad said it was a police officer shot a cop named Fernando, and he didn't have to go to jail. And so instead of saying, shh, let's not talk about that, now we'll actually say, let's find some literature around that. Let's talk about racial marginalization. Let's talk about police brutality. Let's incorporate that and see what academic skills we can use along the way, and talk about using different ways of solving those problems in the larger society. So again, that's the secondary approach. Then we think about critical literacy. A critical literacy approach actually uses traditional reading, traditional and untraditional reading and writing skills and processes to interrogate issues of race and racial oppression, and to use those same processes to respond. So say, for example, in that particular classroom, if you're using that approach, you would essentially put together units around certain issues of race and racial marginalization in your classroom, and then after interrogating those issues, you might encourage your students to then act, that perhaps they'll write a letter to the police department using their literacy skills. And so whatever it may be, the whole idea is using those skills to combat and resist and identify racism. And then there's the more traditional cultural studies approach, where you'll identify one particular racial group, where you'll study and get a breadth and depth of that particular knowledge. So you may say, we're going to spend a month talking about Native American people in society, we're going to spend 2 months talking about Asian American people in society, etc. So again, those are just 4 general approaches. Depending on your classroom, you're going to decide what will work best at a particular moment in time. Okay, now I wish I could tell you that if you get excited after this keynote, when you go back to school in the fall, you're going to be ready to teach children about race and racism. There wouldn't be any consequences. But the reality of it is, because race is very much entrenched as a part of American society, it's very, very rich in terms of who we are. It can be what I like to call a dangerous form of pedagogy. It can be problematic on a lot of different levels. And so these are a few different considerations we want to keep in mind as we engage young children around issues of race. Number 1 is this: we have to come to terms with the idea that race is deeply, deeply personal. I can't begin to unpack and deal with race in the lives of my children unless I first critically reflect on how race operates in my own life. And so for many of us in this particular room, sometimes that's difficult because whiteness is seen as such a normality that it's difficult to even understand how white actually works. Sometimes when I'm working with my pre-service teachers, I'll say, yeah, I want you to identify what race you are. And they'll say, oh, well, I'm just white. I don't have a culture. I don't have a race. Because it's embedded in such a sense of normalcy that it's difficult for them to kind of see how life is outside of that. And so we have to be willing to critically reflect on how race operates in our own life before we can think about how race operates in the lives of others. What privileges do I have as a result of my race? How are certain people marginalized as a result of my race? And what are some things that I can kind of do about that? Then we think about number two, we have to understand that race is deeply, deeply political. What do I mean by political? If you begin talking about race in your building, all of a sudden, you may start finding out that some of the people who are cool with you, friends start dropping out. All of a sudden, family members don't call you. Just, if you don't believe, just go try and go to your 4th of July dinner and start saying, yeah, you know, we need to really fight racism. I was cooking the hot dogs, like, let's get out of here. You won't return your text message, etc. And so we have to decide and count the cost as it deals. Yeah, you said like Thanksgiving, right? You started saying, oh, here you go with that race talk again. So you have to count up the costs and be willing to deal with some of those issues. And then number three, race talk is deeply, deeply problematic. Problematic in terms of certain kinds of consequences we may face, economic consequences, professional consequences, personal consequences, etc. There was a woman once upon a time, Ruth Sherman, in 1998. She was a 3rd grade teacher. I believe it was New York or New Jersey. She had a largely African American and Latino student population in her classroom. She decided, as a means of using multicultural literature, she was going to affirm the rich history of African American females' hairstyles. So she decided to use this book, Nappy Hair, with her students, where she in turn made a copy of each page in the book and sent it home to her students and encouraged them to make connections, right? We talk about connections, talk it over with your family members, talk about how your hair is similar or the same, what do you value about your hair, talk about the history, etc. Pedagogically speaking, a really, really profound, powerful strategy. However, what happened was she sent everything home. A whole host of parents came up to the school and demanded that she got fired, and as a result, she lost her job. So, again, as we think about race and we count up the costs, we have to be knowledgeable of some of the potential consequences that can happen as a result of that. But like anything else in society that's difficult, despite how difficult it may be, it's really, really important for us to embrace that difficulty if we're going to work towards making the world a more racially just place. I like to think of it in terms of James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Thank you. If you have questions.
What did you tell that pre-service teacher to do about that situation?
We met. Actually, she was finishing up the spring semester of her junior year, and so I'll have her in my course this fall, and so we had a chance to actually talk about that. And so we talked about how there's a way to sort of meet with her corporate teacher one-on-one, and you can give her some articles, because people are on a continuum of a journey, and so you don't want to come in and say, hey, let's get out of here, but instead sort of say, this is where she's at, talk to your teacher and say, well, is there a reason why you didn't want to deal with that, and then just say, here are some initial resources to begin the dialogue. And so having that mutually responsive dialogue is, I believe, is really, really vitally important.
Can you go back to the slide where you talked about reader's response?
Yes.
So is there actually a curriculum or a model that teaches and demonstrates for professionals how to do that literature?
There are some, if you email me, I can probably send you some resources, but theoretically speaking, Louise Rosenblatt's work, she'll talk about a lot of reader's response in general. How many people in here use literature circles in their classrooms? The same model, it came from there, but using that specifically to look at issues of race. So just like we will welcome in children's ideas about their summer vacation, etc., as they read a book about that, and we'll kind of create a new meaning. Now the whole idea using it as it relates to race is to sort of say, what are your experiences with race? And you'd be surprised, but even young children, particularly children of color, because they live in a racialized world, like we talked about in the video, where their parents are talking about these things at home. So you'll talk to Johnny and say, you talk about, he say, yeah, my mama said, and police are bad, and then so now it opens up that dialogue, and so you'll find it. But Louise Rosenblatt's work is integral.
Can you answer the lady's question here that she had earlier?
Sure. Would you mind repeating the question? I think it kind of escaped.
Yes. So some of the literature says that kids at around 2 and 2.5, when they're asked to choose a playmate, they choose a same-race playmate, and then something happens between 2, 2.5, and 3, and kids as they get older, they all begin to prefer white. And I just wonder if you've read anything that explains why that happens or how that happens.
Yeah, I would argue some of those same reasons, because of white supremacy, right? So they go home, everybody's white, TV, everybody's white. Stuff that they're reading, everybody's white.
So they're
incorporating that consciously or unconsciously. The teachers are all white, and so what happens is, unless we sort of balance that intentionally, and we say, hey, you know, you're Latino American, let's find some images of positive Latino Americans, so that you don't sort of prefer whiteness over your own racial identity. And so I think a lot of times teachers aren't just conscious of that. I remember a few years ago, we were talking about multicultural literature in one of my graduate level reading endorsement classes, and so there was a woman who taught kindergarten, white woman, and she had been teaching for 17 years, and she said, up until now, I never even looked at the character's race in any of the books I was reading. So think about 17 years she's taught in a predominantly white school district, that she never even, it's not even something that people think as a forethought, and unless they've kind of had some training around that. And so it's important for us to disrupt that. So.
I wish I could talk as fast as you, because unfortunately, racism, systemic racism, is so evasive that teachers, white teachers, they support the racist remarks from young kids, because and they're little like microaggressions.
Absolutely.
They don't know that they've been trained since the cradle to be and respond in this way, because that's just the way it is. Until you consciously take a look at it and say, my epiphany came. I grew up in a home. My grandparents were illiterate. They were part of the Great Migration from the South, and they raised me. And I asked my grandmother what was Hanukkah, and she said, "Oh, that's the Jewish Christmas." Fine, okay. I go to college. One of my best friends is a Jewish girl, and she's celebrating Hanukkah, and I said, "Oh, that's your Christmas," and totally changed me. And I agree there that whenever I got my classroom, I would not have two students sitting beside each other and they not know who they were and what they were about.
Yeah. I like that input. Thank you for sharing that too. I like the inputs that she kind of alluded to. The whole idea is vitally important for us all in this room to have cross-racial relationships, because most people isolate themselves with other people like them. So they go to work with people who look like them, then they play with people who look like them even as adults, and then even on Sunday morning they worship with people who look like them. There's a statistic that says 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in the country. And so what happens is it's difficult for me to learn and grow unless I come into contact with people who are not like me to sort of say, wait a minute, it's not Christmas, honey girl, listen, let me show you something else. And to be open to that dialogue and be sensitive, going back to what I said earlier, because everybody's on a journey. Sometimes I'll run across people who are like, just kill the white people. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, it's important for us to have that mutually responsive dialogue that's open and honest, because in order for people to grow and develop. And so thank you for that contribution.
So we're on a journey, our students are on a journey, and their parents are on a totally different journey too. So, you know, when you're working with 4-year-olds, you know, and you jump onto that journey, sometimes parents say, whoa, we're not ready for that journey yet.
Right.
You know, and so how, do you have ideas on how to get parents to come along as well?
Oh, absolutely. So the whole idea is, as you're working with parents, you just want to start off with this whole idea of plurality, right? And so in as much as it's important to sort of say, we're going to learn about these things in this particular teaching context, we're also going to learn about these other things. So at least we have equal status to begin with, and then as parents become more receptive, then you can kind of get into the critical stuff. So you don't start off day one where here comes the Ku Klux Klan with third graders, right? I mean, 3-year-olds, right? They're like, oh, what teachers think? Get her out of here, right? And so, but as you kind of build your way up, right, you can kind of develop it. And so, again, going back to the political piece, every teacher will draw the line for him or herself, you know, and so in terms of what advocacy they're going to take. And I always say, take whatever agency you can. You know, there may be, the reality of it is some buildings where if you talk about anything, then you may lose your job. And so, but then I would argue there are far more buildings where teachers have that agency that they're not taking it at all. So it's just about negotiating that with your own sense of morality.
And I've also experienced parents who are in the minority saying, please don't bring it up. We don't want to be the token one who's going to be the family who's starting the conversation. Like, they'd rather sort of blend it into the background.
Absolutely, and so it's about being responsive to that particular context. Did I see another hand?
I was just gonna say, so how do you do the cross-racial alliance when you live in a white neighborhood, you go to a white place of worship, and you work in a white female profession? Is there some kind of an organization for teachers that help? For example, one time in my other career, all white females, there was one black nurse, and a physician said, where is whatever her name was? And I said, well, she's the black one. Well, which in my mind is, she's the one that's gonna stand out immediately. I could have said she's wearing white, like everybody was, or, and all the white people said to me, you can't say that. And so, like, as a white person, how do you know if like, in my mind, that wasn't offensive at all. That was a physical description. But other white people thought that was offensive. So how do you get a cross-racial alliance? Is there some organization that, you know, you can call and say, how do I approach this?
I need some black kids here. Latino is covered. I need some black I'm not. Here's what I would say. Here's what I would say. And when you look at like the stereotype research, like About's work, for example, he talks about the importance of finding relationships that are equal status across different races through service. And so meaning that if you go to a place where there's predominantly, let's say African American, for example, like a worship center, church, etc., and then you say, what can I do to serve this community on your terms? You will find that those relationships will happen organically. What happens is, we talked a little bit about this yesterday, instead, a lot of times teachers will come in with a Messiah complex and they'll say, what can I do to help these poor people? Or going back to her Jewish example, if I go to a place of Jewish worship and then I say, well, what can I do to help out here to serve? I'm available. Then you will find those, they'll kind of happen more organically. And people don't do that because of a lot of different issues.
I feel like I've tried to do that, really. I've, gone to other countries, gone to urban, places and volunteered, and I do feel really comfortable there. And like in this room, I'm okay to say
and I'm your friend
that.
too.
I feel
like you got one.
Just like what happened to the student, you're in that moment, you don't have somebody you can phone a friend right there and say.
Yeah, it's definitely, that's what going back to what we were saying, I definitely agree.
Like maybe a class that actually taught that to white teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here are ways to address this.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
This song actually makes me pretty emotional. I think I was talking to this woman here, and we used to actually work in the East Fork back in the day, probably like maybe 11 years ago. And I feel that this is the right place to be. This is where it starts. This is where we have to have the conversations to, one, feel comfortable with talking about race. Even myself, sometimes I think about my son, and like we go to the Carnegie Library. We're the only black people there on Sundays. I'm like, what? We go to the Pittsburgh Toy Library. Again, the only black people there. I'm like, where are the black people at? And like, the thing is, I do want them to be around Asian and Hispanic and other white people and things like that. But I'm like, where are all the black people at? And so, as a black person, I kind of have that, I understand what you're saying as a white person, like, well, where's black people at? And I'm wondering the same thing, where are we at? So, but I think that you're in the right place, and I'm glad that you feel comfortable sharing that. I've said that before, and I'm like, well, she's a black lady, and as a black person, but nobody said, you can't say that, and the reason why is because my skin complexion. So what you're saying that, I guess, people might perceive you as being racist when you say that, but that's not even what you mean.
Well, I think it was what you were talking about, colorblindness. It
Right.
would be like I'm denying that I noticed that she's black.
Right.
In my mind,
Right.
there's nothing wrong with it, and it was the white people who said, you can't say that. It wasn't her. I already had a relationship with her, and she was fine with it.
Right, right.
Any other questions?
Not necessarily a question, but I did want to share with the group as well. Like she said, this is the space where you can do that. But also you have to go outside of your comfort zone, like of all times. Go and look at the city paper, look into what's going on, And something that may interest you on one thing, but you know there's going to be a diverse set of people in that space, so that you are around people in that space and you can see and observe things as opposed to automatically assuming something or asking something. And sometimes people are having a hard time to have those conversations or to ask something that they've wanted to know for a very long time. But for instance, I was in a play in college, and this was a time where I was getting relaxers and things like that. So my hair was super straight, but it was like long and dark hair or whatever. And so I'm with a group of people in this play. I'm like one of maybe 2 or 3 in a play of 50 people. I went to Penn State. And so a young lady asked me if she could touch my hair. And a couple of other black ladies were standing there, and they're like, oh, hell no. You know, and I said, sure. And they were stunned. Like, why did you let her touch her hair? Why did she ask you if she wants to touch her hair? She came from outside of, like, somewhere in New York, never was around black people, never had that close proximity. We had classes with 500 people. You're never going to go up to your classmate and say, come on, touch your hair. You know, so we had just happened to spend time together. And we have a responsibility to include ourselves in people's learning about each other and to not take everything personally. And so it wasn't personal at all. It was a learning experience for her. And for me to say no would be, you know, stifling that. And so I just want to encourage everybody to have those conversations and put yourself in spaces that are uncomfortable. And there are consequences to it. People won't be mad at you, problematic type of a thing, but that's just how it is. Try to explain yourself as much as possible, but take that, you know, take that chance.
We'll let Mike have the last question, and then we have to close. But we'll continue dialogue on our session. But they're telling me I only have 2 minutes.
I'll be on in 2 minutes, I promise. So, mine's just another comment. You know, we see all these different worlds come together in a space like this. But it's critical that in our spaces that we live, right, that we interrupt and disrupt. You know, local, personal, immediate, I'm a white male. And unfortunately, in my neighborhood, a bunch of white middle class people who live in a bubble, right? You guys know what I mean. If you're white middle class, you know what that bubble is. Your world, you know, and when we talk about the magical consciousness versus a critical consciousness, it's important as white middle class Americans that we interrupt that magical consciousness any and every time we can. And again, it's an uncomfortable space, right? But that's the best work we can do within our own spaces, if that's where we find ourselves. You know, at that cookout, right? When someone does a microaggression or mentions something, oh, you know, and then you say something, you know what the response always, well, I got body. My niece married by a guy, this is cool, you know what I mean? Right? Right? But there's these things. But even like what you were referring to, you know, this whole idea of, as a white person, this uncomfortableness of calling somebody black, describing somebody as black or as Muslim or whatever. Why? That in itself is something that needs to be interrupted within our white spaces, right? Because if we don't, then it perpetuates. So I know when I'm at the cookout down the street, right, with these people who are good people and they're fine, I know that when I say that, it's going to be uncomfortable for a moment or 2 or 3, but I feel like I planted a seed of consciousness to where it begins to be okay within their own circles to have these conversations, and people can't come to spaces like this and have real conversations unless they've checked themselves somewhat or are prepared for that. So we've got to continue to plant those seeds. So I look at the work I do in my school that's very diverse here in the city as super important, but I also look at the work I do as a white boy from West Virginia. Right? It's cool. It's cool. Don't judge. It's okay. But as that guy, it's critical that in my spaces that I continue to interrupt and disrupt in a respectful way. And sometimes I don't get respect back. But I'm planting those seeds that make these conversations allowable in those spaces, because we can have this, and if I go back to my white middle class bubble, there's no work that hasn't been done. We have to do that.
Thank you, Mike, for that.
On that note, we're going to again thank Dr. Terry Husband for his brilliant, insightful, and an amazing facilitator. Also funny. You are funny. Very, very, very funny. On behalf of the Center for Urban Education Summer Educator Forum 2017, wish to present you with this small token for your work as a facilitator with us. And inside of here is a mug, I'm going to tell you. This mug is our big deal mug. Hercules sipped from this mug. Mary Magdalene, everybody had a taste of this mug. As a token for your diligence, the amount of time and effort that you put into preparing this, and also facilitating our small group sessions, thank you, thank you, thank you. We are going to have a break. There are some pastries and water over here. There's also some fruit and granola bars for any of you who are interested in that. We will reconvene in your groups at 10:30. So.